Dr. SEC on Twitter and drsec.org. So thanks for being with us. We appreciate it.
Hey, glad to be on the show, guys.
All right, let's just talk a little bit about, obviously you cover the SEC, and let's just kind of recap back a little bit. Really hadn't hit on football since the Tigers were down in the Orange Bowl, but just kind of give us a preview of some of the spring games coming up and some of the, I guess, dark horses you look forward to in the SEC this upcoming year.
Well, you know, it's really an interesting spring. I can't remember a time where there were really more storylines headed into the spring than there is right now. I mean, you just think about the quarterback position. You think about all the great quarterbacks that have left the SEC, Aaron Murray, Connor Shaw, Zach Mettenberger. You keep going down the line, A.J. McCarron. I mean, there's so many. Really, there's only a few teams that have their starting quarterback coming back this season. So that in itself makes a lot of interesting storylines. And then when you take on new coaches, you look at Vanderbilt, who has a new coach. You look at Florida, who's bringing a new offensive coordinator. You look at Tennessee, who Butch Jones is in year 2 now. So it's full of great storylines. It's really which way you want to go. But unfortunately, kind of stealing all the headlines right now is kind of in the SEC, same song, second verse, and that is players being suspended from various teams.
And looking at that also, obviously with Green Beckham from Missouri, Missouri's had some issues this week. And I hate to harp back on it, but it seems like every year the Georgia Bulldogs, every year. And, I like Mark Richt and all, but it just seems like, I think you can count on a couple others. It's only April.
Yeah, and like Steve Spurrier, Georgia fans hate Steve Spurrier, but he said it right last year when he said they had to play him a little later in the year. And he said, I always like playing Georgia's second game because I know they're going to have players suspended. So, that's kind of was. And really going into the offseason and headed into spring, I really felt like Georgia was in South Carolina, but I really thought Georgia was the lead runner for the SEC East because you look at all the offense they've got coming back, all the players that were injured last year. I mean, they're going to have probably the best playmakers and running back core under Mark Richt. You got Jeremy Pruitt coming from Florida State to take over the defense. Todd Grantham's gone, so that's addition by subtraction. But then your two safeties, one's kicked off the team, just announced he's going to Arkansas, and Josh Harvey Clemens, who was a rising star. And then you got Trey Matthews, who was part of Checkgate, the dumb checking, $70 is going to cost him probably 2, 3, 4 ball games. And now that secondary is very vulnerable. They got Clemson the first game, South Carolina the second game, and they're going to be without, any of their starters last year in that back part of the secondary.
Right, and once again, we're joined by the Dr. SEC on WSBF FM Clemson. Let's talk a little bit about, obviously, harping back on South Carolina and Georgia. Clemson obviously has vested interest in those two teams. Looking at Georgia a little bit, losing their star quarterback, Aaron Murray. Who do you look to see taking the front runner in that quarterback position? And obviously with Marshall and Todd Gurley coming back will be two big additions for the Georgia Bulldogs.
Yeah, it really should be a really good offense this year. They've got the whole offense coming back, minus a couple linemen and Aaron Murray, and that's a big minus. But the guy they got coming in there is really good, and that's Hudson Mason. He owns all kinds of Georgia state records, and he came in last year. He came in the second half of the Kentucky game when Murray got hurt, and he played well. And then he went into the Georgia Tech game, and they went way down the Georgia Tech early, but he led them back from the big deficit, passed for 300 yards, I believe a couple touchdowns. And then he goes into the bowl game and, starts off a little slow. Then he gets going and finished with over 300 yards passing. But the big thing is he's got a whole offseason to prepare. One thing we know, Mark Richt does a good job with quarterbacks, and he's got a whole year to prepare. He's been in the system. He's a fifth-year senior. But what he's got coming around him was what is special. He's got Todd Gurley, who I believe is the most complete running back in college football. When you take in ability, his size, speed, blocking ability, catching ability, everything that he does, I think he's the best all-around back in college football. Keith Marshall should be back to 100%, but if not, they got two of the top 5 recruits coming in to kind of back him up. So they'll be good at running back. Wide receiver, they ought to be really good. You remember last year, first touchdown of the game against Clemson, their number 1 receiver, Malcolm Mitchell, goes up and does a little chest bump, comes down and tears his ACL. He should be back. Then their new number 1 became Justin Scott Wesley, who had the big game against South Carolina, the big touchdown, and put him away, and he was doing real well. He tore his ACL. And then you had Michael Bennett, who hurt his knee. He'll be back. You look across the board, they got Chris Conley coming back. They're loaded on offense. I mean, they really are. This offense should be very, very good if they can stay healthy. This should be about as good offense as they had. One thing I like about Hudson Mason, Aaron Murray was kind of knocked for, he was great. He's statistical leader in about every SEC category for his career. They've never had an SEC quarterback pass for 3,000 yards in 3 seasons. He did it all 4 seasons. But he had a way of kind of going away when the game was on the line. And he kind of improved on that last year. But Hudson Mason's right the opposite. He came in, led them from behind against Georgia Tech, came in against Nebraska, and was on the game-winning drive, and he hit 2 seniors in the hands, and they dropped the passes, or they'd won that game well. So on offense, they're going to be in great shape. The question for Georgia is that defense. Now, they've got 9 guys, would have had 10 guys coming back. We'll only have 8 guys back against Clemson to start the year if nobody else gets suspended, and they don't take no more pot tests between now and then. But that secondary should be much better. There's rave reviews. Jeremy Pruitt did a fantastic job, at Florida State, and they seem really thrilled about it. And I know Clemson's losing a lot, but man, you don't want to face that offensive coordinator your first game with a short hand if you're Georgia. Yeah.
Well, no, but some of the returning players, you got me a little worried with Georgia's offense going there. But I think in that game, it's really going to be about who can find a leader and a quarterback and who can step up, because I think Clemson's strength, honestly, is going to be their defense, having one of the better front forwards in the nation, with Vic Beasley deciding to come back. And the way that Clemson's going to is if they're going to pull the victory down in Athens, it's going to have to be with their defense in a way. But looking at other things around the league, talk a little bit about James Franklin. Obviously, he left Vanderbilt to go to Penn State. And just to go to the state of Tennessee, talk about what Butch Jones is doing, because I really believe that if South Carolina was going to have won the East and won the conference by now, it would have been when Tennessee and all these Florida was down. But when you see them trending upward, I think it's going to be much harder for them to win.
And you're right about that, and I give them a lot of credit because they finished number 4 in the country last year. But, man, what an opportunity they blew in that Tennessee game last year, because if they win that game, they're going to go against Auburn. And going against Auburn, they had some good matchups there. Maybe could have won that game. It could have slipped even possibly into the national championship game. But once again, unfortunately for South Carolina, every year they have that game. And last year it was Tennessee. I like what Butch Jones is doing. He signed a big class, a great, as far as depth recruiting class. They have some really good playmakers this year coming in. JUCO kid at wide receiver who's going to be maybe all SEC his first year. They've got a lot of good things going. The problem for Tennessee is their schedule. You look on Tennessee's schedule next year, and they only have one game that you say, okay, that's a give me. Now, they've got others that they ought to win, but let me, when you look at the schedule, they start off, they got Utah State and Arkansas State. Now, those teams, they're not world beaters, but, they're not terrible either. And they could slip up if they don't bring their A game and win that game. And then they got to travel to Norman, Oklahoma, and play Oklahoma. And when you take that in consideration, and you take the fact that their cross rival in the SEC is Alabama, I really don't think they're going to make a bowl game this year. I mean, they're going to be much better. I think you're going to see it. You're going to see the improvement on the field. But unless they pull at least a couple of upsets, I mean, I really don't see a way they're going to make it to a bowl game next year. Now, I don't think that's the end all, but look at that schedule. Like I said, you got the first 2 games; those ought to be wins, even though they're definitely not give-me's.
Right.
But you go from there. Then you go once again. You go to Oklahoma. Here's where it gets really rough for them, if it wasn't already rough. And whoever schedules the Tennessee schedule ought to really be reprimanded or fired or something, because he's hurt them quite a bit with the Oregon games and all of that. But then after Oklahoma, you go to Georgia, you got Florida at home, then you got Chattanooga. That's the give-me. Then you got Ole Miss, and Ole Miss is a team who's really on the rise and should be good this season. You got Alabama, South Carolina, then you got Kentucky. Now, they should be Kentucky, but Kentucky, Mark Stoops is doing a good job down there, and Missouri and Vanderbilt. So it's going to be tough to make a bowl game for Tennessee next year, but I think they're going to be better.
Right.
But Vanderbilt, I think they do make a bowl game just based solely upon their schedule. I think think they're going to take a step back next year, not because I don't think Coach Mason is not a great coach, but you look at what they've lost, and especially Jordan Matthews. I mean, that guy, to me, he's the most complete wide receiver in the SEC since A.J. Green. I mean, and what he did, catching on 2 or 3 guys with very, and the guys he had throwing to them. But, they're out of conference games this year. They got Temple. They got UMass. They got Charleston Southern, Old Dominion. That's 4 wins right there. So they've only got to win 2 more to get bowl eligible. I expect them to do that, but I think 6 or 7 wins for Vanderbilt.
Right, I totally agree. But I believe that old Butch Jones, he inherited a pretty poor situation. I think he's really making the best out of it. And I always believe, I don't know, I mean, you cover the SEC for a living. Do you think Peyton Manning would go back when he retires? I think he'd be a great coach. I think he'd be absolutely perfect.
I think he's going to go probably if he doesn't go to NFL somewhere, he's probably going to go there in some capacity.
Right.
Still very big on the campus. He's still a guy that he lets use his name, and he's an icon down here, and so I really expect, and I live in Tennessee, I really expect him to come back in some capacity, if it's not administrative role, something to have a big part. But I think Butch Jones has them headed in the right direction. But when you have what they had, you had Philip Fulmer, who was letting the crazy people run the asylum there at the end, even though he was a good coach. Then you went to Lane Kiffin for a year and all the mess he caused. Then you went to Derek Dooley, and somebody please tell me, how do you, if you're the University of Tennessee, you're this amazing brand that is Tennessee at the time, one of the greatest programs in the history of college football. How do you go to Louisiana and get a coach that's got a 4-8 record out of a losing conference? I mean, it was a terrible hire. It was bound to fail, and they should have cut him loose earlier, and they didn't, and it's cost them. And Butch Jones, though, I think is picking up the parts, but it's not going to happen overnight. Right,
and I always think, when Tennessee's good, the SEC's better, college football, because, they have some of the most passionate fans, and I want to see that Tennessee-Alabama game get back to where Tennessee starts beating them, and then, that's always kept Alabama in check, is when Auburn and Tennessee have been good, it's kind of evened it out a little bit, but now you've seen them go down a little bit, but they're trending upward, so it'll be interesting to see what happens there. But let's move on to the state of Alabama, I guess, and with Alabama, it looks like they have a pretty weak streak of schedule again. They don't have to play Georgia in the regular season. They draw Florida from the East and Tennessee. Florida coming off of just a horrific year. And they open up with West Virginia. And obviously this mess with the rule changes with Arkansas and Alabama, Bielema and Saban trying to, kind of slow down the game a little bit. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, you're absolutely correct. I mean, they pulled – I mean, you look at their schedule, their first 3 games are against West Virginia, Florida, and Southern Miss. I think there's about 5 or 6 wins altogether combined for those teams. They're catching, once again, then they go to Western Carolina later in the season. I mean, give them a lot of credit. They've figured out how to kind of manipulate the system, and they really do play a soft out-of-conference schedule. Now, I'll say this about Alabama. We've got to catch a little break. I mean, they didn't know Virginia Tech was going to end up being as bad as they've been. Sure. They didn't know when they scheduled West Virginia they were going to be as bad as they are. But it's getting a little ridiculous year in and year out that not only do they pull this easy out-of-conference schedule, but they're not catching Georgia. They're not catching South Carolina. They did get Florida this year, but that's as close to, they're usually pulling the very least out of the East. And
well, it was Kentucky last year.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing. I mean, They've been able to do that year in and year out. SEC fans have been scratching their heads and upset about it for a long time. I don't know what's going to change it, but something has to change. It's definitely unfair that year in and year out that they're playing, the Kentuckys and the year before Vanderbilt, and they're playing these teams when Georgia and South Carolina, and they were scheduled to have Georgia, but they took Georgia off the schedule last year or 2 years ago when they added Missouri and Texas A&M.
Right. And, I mean, you look at that. I mean, you would think that somebody like Alabama, being the powerhouse they are, could, call it down in Tallahassee or a team like that. I mean, you could definitely set up a series, especially with this new playoff. You're going to have to start scheduling harder. I mean, at least one tough out-of-conference. I give credit to the University of Georgia. They opened up with Clemson on the road, and then they played South Carolina the next week, and then they played LSU in September. So, I mean, it was a gauntlet of a schedule. They got through it, but it just seems a little interesting. And let's just talk a little bit about before we let you go with the SEC network, how big it's going to be? Obviously, getting Brent Musburger on there, Jesse Palmer, some of those guys. What kind of impact do you think it's going to have?
I think it's going to bring a lot more money. It's going to bring a lot more money in, and I think that the power of the SEC fan base was clearly on display when they got into this recent feud. I believe was it DirecTV or I believe it was DirecTV or Dish Network won, but I believe it was DirecTV. DirecTV sent out an email, said, we don't know if we're going to do it. By the end of the day, they backtracked because they were absolutely, attacked by every SEC fan base in the Southeast. And so it's definitely going to help financially. Not that there was really a problem there. Most of them are pulling in money. It's going to help it with exposure, even though that really wasn't a problem. So I would say really it's more of the icing on the cake than it is too big of a deal, because they really have been kind of the premier conference as far as money and exposure goes anyhow.
That's right on, and I agree 100% with you. And last thing before we let you, what do you make of this situation with the cane culture thing at Northwestern and this labor union mess? Because, in the Southeast, a lot of right-to-work states, it's public institutions. I mean, I don't know how it's ever going to work. What do you make of that?
Well, I was looking at it, and we were talking about this. I was on a show in Memphis this morning talking about it. And here's the thing. The pay-for-play is as good as it sounds in theory. It's never going to work, because Title IX requires that you put the same amount of money into the female sports and the other non-revenue sports as you do football and basketball. And they're never going to be able to afford to do that. I mean, it's just the reality. I mean, you look at some of the schools right now that are having to cut back programs, it's just not going to happen because of Title IX. But at the same time, I do believe the players deserve to have a voice, because in a lot of ways there's some things that aren't right going on. For example, I think that the cost of living and cost of attending college needs to be covered. Right now that falls short. I think if you give a scholarship, it ought to cover. They should be going to bed, hungry, having to wonder where food comes from. But more importantly, some of the things I would like to see, and I don't know how you feel about it, but, these one-year scholarship renewals.
I agree.
If you're going to give a player a scholarship, you give them 4 years, now if he breaks the rules and things like that, that's different. But you're the ones that are paid. Coaches are paid, and here's what happens, and I've seen it in the SEC over and over and over again, especially in the West, and Alabama's probably the biggest one to do it. But they'll get players in, and if they don't perform up to the standard they thought they would, they go ahead and either cut them or tell them you're going to you're going to have to transfer, or we're going to give you medical. Do whatever they have to do. And because it's only a one-year scholarship, they're able to manipulate these kids and take them out of positions they ought to be in. And not only that, but you tell the player, you say, okay, you only get a one-year promise from us, but you've got to give us 4 years or a degree, or if you try to transfer, you're going to have to sit out a year of football. Now, how is that fair? That you could only promise them a year, but they've got to promise you at least 4 years or a college degree, or they're not going to be able to. They're going to have to sit out a year of their life. It's really not to the NCAA is not set up to the benefit of the student athlete. They need to change it, but I know that they need to have a voice. But I'm not sure, as you said, the legal ramifications. I'm not sure if this union is going to work or not.
Yeah, I think culture had good intentions with some, and honestly, I don't think most of those kids really are looking for payments. They just want their cost of living, and I agree 1,000%. I just don't know if they went about it the right way with the unions, because you're going to run into so much flack with that. And if you look at the sports that make the profit, basketball, football, I mean, a couple schools make a baseball profit, but very few. And you don't want to have to cut those other athletes out of the other Olympic sports because of, it's just going to be a mess. But I agree 1,000% about that's how Saban's caught some flack for that with the cutting players. It's almost like a pro team in a way, which is really not fair to the kids when they're investing so many hours and you want them to represent your school. Well, it ought to be the same way both ways. But but if you have any, just give us a few. I guess before we let you go, a few of your sleeper teams in the SEC who you look to make some noise. Just pick a couple in the East and West if you could, and we appreciate the time.
Absolutely. Well, I think out of the East, you're looking at your two front runners are going to be Georgia and South Carolina. I mean, Georgia's offense ought to be absolutely prolific. Unless Hudson Mason gets hurt, it ought to be a really, really good offense. Obviously South Carolina's got a lot coming back. Mike Davis and some proven things there. I think the teams to kind of watch out for to kind of make movements up that ladder is, first of all, Missouri. Even though they made it last year, they're still not expected to do much this year, especially with the recent suspension of Dorial Green Beckham. And so kind of watch out for Missouri and watch for Florida because they still have a lot of talent on campus. And Will Muschamp is playing for his job. And if his players love him like they say they love him, then they might make a run. But the West is, to me, where it really gets interesting because you expect Alabama, Auburn, and LSU to be right up there at the top. But two teams that you really got to watch out for are the two Mississippi teams, Ole Miss and Mississippi State. Ole Miss, has Bo Wallace and company coming back. He's going to be now in year 3. He made some strides last year. He had the turnovers in the Egg Bowl against Mississippi State that really hurt him. But Ole Miss really should be a very good team this year. Their defense is loaded. I mean, I'll be really surprised if I wrote an article, I write in several magazines, but one in Rebel Nation magazine. If they don't win 10 games next year, it's a failure, and they really could go further than that. And the other team, in my opinion, is Mississippi State. Dan Mullen finally has that Tim Tebow-type quarterback back there with Dak Prescott. They got the leading wide receiver as far as reception and yards goes coming back in Jamian Lewis. They've got a lot of great players coming back on defense. And so be aware of Ole Miss and Mississippi State. Those teams really could because, listen, Alabama is replacing their quarterback. LSU is replacing their quarterback, and they've got a favorable schedule. So if they're able to knock off an Alabama who has a lot more question marks than we're used to this year, especially now with Eddie Johnson just going down in the secondary again, this really, Ole Miss, Mississippi State could shock some people and really move up that ladder. So those two teams, I would say more than anybody in the SEC, are the dark horses to make some noise.
Right, and tell, once again, thanks for joining, and tell the listeners where they can find you on your radio show on the Waiting Room, I believe it is, syndicated in 5 different states. Tell us where we can find you.
Yeah, I'm actually, hey, listen, I'm pulling a doubleheader right now. Right now, as we speak, my show is on.
Oh, wow. No, don't take a time away from that. No, go back to that.
No. I had a couple pre-recorded interviews running the first half, and because we had to kind of fit them around, so I'm good to go. I've got time. But it's running, and it's on Monday through Friday on Yahoo Sports Radio in Memphis, and then we take a smaller version of that and we syndicate it to different stations, whether it be 30 minutes or an hour. That one's 2 hours long. And so, but you can go to my Twitter account, which is the Dr. SEC, THEDR SEC, and I usually tweet out everything there. I write for 6 different magazines. We got a new website going up. We had it. We kind of put the front page on, and we're hoping to have the rest up over the weekend, but that's drsec.org.
All right, well, we really appreciate the time, and we'll definitely get you back on. You have immense knowledge of the SEC, been covering it in Memphis, obviously coming from the state of Tennessee, deep in SEC country. So we appreciate it, and we'll get you back on when football starts rolling around.
Hey, that's awesome, man. It was an honor to be on.
Oh, no, it was ours. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
And that's the Dr. SEC coming on WSBF FM Clemson. We appreciate his time. That's